Hello, we're going to continue on now with the microanatomy, the microscopic anatomy of what's going on in your skin, the integumentary system. There's a whole lot more going on in the skin than maybe you ever actually thought about. Lots of interesting structures there. The skin is actually, I was very surprised when I first learned about the skin and how complex and fascinating it really was. So let's move forward and talk about the skin. Now there's quite a bit of information in the physiology lectures about the different structures in the skin and what they do. So even though I tend to be long-winded, I'm going to try to mainly focus in on the anatomy here and not talk a whole lot about the function. It's hard to separate the two. It's hard to just point out structures and not want to talk about what they're doing to kind of tie everything together. All right, so this is a generic skin chunk diagram, which I pulled directly from your textbook, so get used to taking a look at this, and you should learn all of the different structures you see there on that diagram you're going to need to be familiar with, and we'll be talking about what they do over on the physiology side. Now, believe it or not, I was looking one time at an NCLEX, that's the nursing certification exam you take when you finish nursing school and before you can actually get a job and practice as a nurse. I was looking at a practice guide one time and looking over in the anatomy section, you know, what types of anatomy questions do they actually expect you to know on the nursing certification exam. And I was kind of surprised to see a skin chunk on there, and they actually had structures in the skin labeled, and they were asking students who were taking those exams to identify skin parts. So now, out of all the things and out of all the anatomy that you learn, I would not have expected a skin chunk to show up on the certification exam, but that just shows you that they do expect you to know your stuff when you finish up nursing school. All right, so we're going to talk about, first of all, the skin is divided into two major layers. And this one right here that you see, the border, the wiggly border there at the bottom, or the deep border, all that brown area you see there, that's one of the two. That's called your epidermis. You've no doubt heard that term before. That is the superficial major layer of the skin. And then all of this that you see here, where you see the pinkish area and you see all those various little structures in there, that's called the dermis. So that's your deeper major layer of the skin, in which you have lots of accessory structures, or your textbook also calls those appendages of the skin. And then finally down in here, and even deeper than that, you get into a tissue layer called the hypodermis. That's also called the subcutaneous layer, sub meaning underneath. Remember, cutaneous. Or if you've seen your physiology lectures for chapter 4, we talked about how the skin is a type of subcutaneous, or a type of cutaneous, I'm sorry, a cutaneous membrane. The skin is a cutaneous membrane. So subcutaneous means beneath the skin. So the hypodermis, which literally means, hopefully by now you're remembering that hypo means underneath or below the dermis. So that's where those names come from. The hypodermis, now some people consider that to be a third layer of the skin, and some people do not, and we're not going to stress out over that too much. I generally refer to the two major layers of the skin, the epidermis and the dermis, and then the hypodermis is its own separate part of the body, which is connecting. You have connective tissue there. It's connecting the skin to your skeletal muscles underneath. Connective tissues connect. They bind different parts of the body together. All right, so those were the two major layers of the skin, and where you would find the hypodermis underneath. Now let's focus in on the epidermis in more detail. And we're going to take a look at the sublayers of the epidermis. All right, so what we're seeing over here, this is actually what the epidermis of the skin, if you cut it sliced it like this, going from superficial surface of the body down deeper, and then took that two-dimensional section through the epidermis and put that on a slide and looked at it under the microscope, this is what you would see over here. So all of this is epidermis. Now down in here you're getting into the dermis. You're seeing just a little bit of the dermis in that location. All right, so your epidermis, it consists of, what's our tissue type there? The tissue type is stratified squamous epithelium. Okay, so all of this is classified as stratified squamous epithelium. So you have that at the, that's what your epidermis of your skin is composed of. You also have stratified squamous epithelium inside your mouth, like lining your cheeks or your buccal cavity, lining the oral cavity, lining the pharynx, the esophagus. You also have the stratified squamous epithelium there. Now you're going to learn on the Chapter 5 physiology lectures that the skin is keratinized, which means it has at the surface lots and lots and lots of keratin protein fibers, which help you give your skin its dryness and special barrier properties. The stratified squamous epithelial tissues inside your mouth, the pharynx, and on down into the esophagus are not keratinized. Those are wet tissues. Keratinized skin is not wet, as you guys know, like those inner parts in those locations inside the body. So that's our tissue name. So the cells are flat. Now down here deeper, as you get close to the dermis, the cells take on more of a cuboidal shape. But if you guys remember, a stratified epithelial tissue is named according to the shapes of the cells at the surface or at the lining of that particular tissue, or the apical surface, if you remember that. And since the cells up there are flat, that's why it's called a stratified squamous epithelium. All right, let me erase that. All right, so the epidermis is actually divided up into multiple sublayers. And those sublayers have different things going on, which we'll talk about on the physiology lectures. Let's start down here at the bottom. All right, so now that's dermis. You're seeing just a little bit of the dermis there in pink. Now down here at the very bottom, you've got a very thin sublayer there that is called the stratum. It's at the base, so it's called the stratum basale or basale. You'll hear different pronunciations for that. And that's really just a single layer thick there. As you move upwards from there, you have several layers of cells which are flattening out as you move upward in the epidermis towards the surface. And that's called the stratum spinosum. As you move upward, there is yet another layer. If you were looking under the microscope, see over here on an actual slice of epidermis how those cells look darker, and if you look really closely you'll see lots of dark purple spots in there. Those are granules that those contain keratin that's being manufactured, so that you'll have that up on the surface of the skin, and also some waterproofing sugar lipid combinations that are being made, and they really stain darkly in that particular sublayer. That's called the stratum granulosum. And then finally up in here, the most superficial portion of the epidermis is called the stratum corneum. And the stratum corneum, you really just have dead skin cells. You know how you've heard before that the uppermost part of the surface of your skin consists of dead skin cells? It really does. The cells in the stratum corneum are just really dead, and they contain lots of keratin protein fibers, and you've also got some waterproofing sugar lipid combinations called glycolipids there. So your stratum corneum really gives you a nice tight barrier at the surface of the skin, a nice waterproof barrier, at the surface of the skin, helps protect you from cuts and abrasions, things like bacteria getting in easily. Also helps prevent loss of water from your body fluids by evaporation, and also prevents water from being taken up through the skin. Imagine if you walked outside and it was raining and you could absorb water through your skin. You might just get a little bit poofy if that could actually happen. All right, I'm going to change pen colors here for a second. There is, in thick skin areas, you would have right in here, you would have an additional sublayer in thick skin layers only, and that is called the stratum lucidum. Because the cells would actually, if you were looking at them under the microscope, you don't see them over here because that's not from thick skin. They look clear. They're dead cells. They don't take up the stains that they use on the tissues, and so they look lucid or clear. But you only see that in thick areas of the skin, and by thick I mean in your plantar region and palmar regions, palms and soles of the foot. That's where you would find that particular sublayer. Functions of those sublayers, again, will be covered on the physiology side. Oh, let me back up just for a second. The main cell type in the epidermis, because I've got this on your anatomy guide over here, main cell type. So if you're looking closely at your diagram, you've got cell, 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 cell. Those cells are called keratinocytes. So if you remember when we were going over connective tissues, we said in your connective tissues proper, you have fibroblasts. That's your main cell type in those locations. In your hyaline cartilage, chondrocytes are your main functioning cell type that help make all the components of that tissue. In your epidermis, keratinocytes, those are your main cell type that are making keratin. Now you may be wondering, well, I thought we just said that they were squamous epithelial cells. They are squamous epithelial cells. That tells you their shape, it tells you what type of tissue they're located in, but you can have squamous epithelial tissues, squamous epithelial cells in different locations in the body that have very different functions. So they're going to have different functional names depending on what their unique jobs are. So in the epidermis, they're called keratinocytes because they're cranking out lots of keratin protein that you have up here in the stratum corneum, and that largely is what gives you the barrier properties that you have there on the epidermis. There are some other cell types here too. I'm not going to ask you to identify those on the anatomy exam, but I will talk about their functions on the physiology side for this particular unit. All right, now let's talk about the dermis. Moving on down here, we've got lots of things going on. So the dermis, again, from here to here, that's your dermis. The dermis also has two sublayers. All right, so right in here up at the top, I'll turn on my highlighter here. Right in there, oops. Up in here where you see these little hills poking up into the epidermis, where you see those hills, just up there, the most superficial parts of the dermis. That's called the papillary sublayer. And then everything deep to there within the dermis is called the reticular sublayer. All right, then how about our tissue types? Your papillary sublayer is built from areolar tissue. Your reticular sublayer is built from dense, irregular connective tissue. So you want to be real careful when you're studying the anatomy, if you're taking the anatomy test, and I'll have practice activities for you guys with this. Read the questions carefully, because the question may say, There might be an arrow pointing to the papillary sublayer. If the question says, name the sublayer of this portion of the skin, that's going to be the papillary sublayer. If it says, name the tissue that this sublayer is composed of, that's areolar tissue. Same thing down with the reticular sublayer. Is it asking you the sublayer name? That's reticular. Is it asking you the type of tissue that sublayer is composed of? It's made of dense, irregular connective tissue. Is it asking you the major layer of the skin? The major layer would be the dermis. So when you're studying, you probably want to kind of flow chart some of these things out so you know which things are divisions of others. That would be a good thing to do with the tissues as well, just to kind of help you learn the organization and breakdown of these different things. You may also have questions about cell types. You know, like what would your major workhorse cell type be down here in the dermis? Really in either location. If you think back to when we went over dense, irregular, and areolar connective tissues, on the tissue side of the anatomy for this unit, we said those were called fibroblasts. Those are your main workhorse cells in these tissues that make many of the filler components that you see in the extracellular matrix. So keep those things in mind. Your fibroblasts would just be scattered around within those locations. All right, let's see what I got on the next one. Let me back up here just for a second. All right, and again, now down here, very deep, down in here, on this little skin chunk, we said that was the hypodermis layer. And what tissue type do you have in the hypodermis? Mainly adipose tissue. You have adipose loose connective tissue. All right, and those little yellow globs there, if I pointed to one of those and said, what's your cell type that you have down in there? What's your cell type? All right, adipose loose connective tissue, or cell type in there, adipocytes, located in those areas. Now those little globs you see there on the diagram are too big for individual adipocytes. Those are clusters where you have a whole bunch of them there in that fatty tissue. But if I said, what cell type would you find in here, that would be adipocytes, or some people say adipocytes. Either of those are okay. All right, I'm going to bring this picture up because this is actually a image of some laboratory models we have in our labs at Calhoun of skin, and I'm bringing these up because I think it's easier to see some of these accessory structures in the skin on these skin models. They're blown up a little bit more than they are in your textbook diagram. So I think they're really useful for understanding some of these different structures. So I'm going to use these to point out some of the other things that we need to know. So this is actually a representation of skin from your scalp. All right, so on this diagram, here's your epidermis up here. And on the model, they actually do show the different sublayers that you would have of the epidermis, and they're in different colors, as you can see there. And then if you go down from here to there, there's your dermis. And then, of course, down in here, you've got your hypodermis on this image of the skin model. All right, so what is this over here? This structure that you see right there is called a hair follicle. And we'll talk a little bit more about hair follicles on the physiology side. A little brown thing that's sticking up and heading up toward the surface there, that is called a hair shaft. That's your actual hair. So if this is a slice of skin from your scalp, you guys know you have hair shafts protruding up through the surface there. You actually have hairs protruding through the surface of the skin in most parts of your body. It's just those hairs are a lot finer and thinner in most areas when compared to the top of your head. Okay, so that's a hair follicle and a hair shaft. Let me erase all of that. So I have a little more. Oops, there we go. Erase. Okay, now what about, let me show you guys, let me highlight in this little structure that you see right here. The little red structure kind of looks like a muscle on the skin model, and it is. That is called an erector with an I, with an A, not an E. Erector pili muscle. And do you see how it's connected over here to the hair follicle? Those are little tiny microscopic muscles that you have in the dermis of the skin, and they're composed of the tissue type smooth muscle tissue. All right, so that's involuntary muscle that contracts without you thinking about it. When those little microscopic muscles contract, you know that's going on because you have goosebumps on the surface of your skin. And what that's doing is it's making the hair stand up on end, makes the hair stand erect. Now, most of us, that doesn't really go on in the scalp. Your hair's not standing up on end. But, if you've ever, like a cat, when a cat fluffs itself out when it gets stressed out or scared, that's because its erector pili muscles are pulling on its fur and making the fur stand on end. So that actually happens in humans as well. And you see it more so as goosebumps because we don't have body fur like other mammals do. But we still have, nevertheless, because our close mammal relatives have these erector pili muscles, so do we. They're left over from our ancestral past, even though we don't really have fur anymore. And when they contract, they pull on those hairs and make them stand on end at the surface. But we really just see that as goosebumps when that happens. Well, I didn't point out, too, your hair follicle over here, the tissue type, mainly built from epithelial tissue. Hair follicles are almost like part of the epidermis that has invaginated, dipped down into the dermis. And it takes on this special function of making hair shafts rather than making keratin like you would have at the surface of the skin. Hair shafts are built from keratin as well, just like the stratum corneum portion of the epidermis is. All right, I'm going to erase all of those things. All right, let's take a look over here. This little blue structure you see here, where that's all wadded up like a little blue tube all bundled up together, that is called an eccrine sweat gland. And I imagine you can figure out what that produces. That's what makes sweat. And this little tube that you see here is the eccrine sweat gland duct. Eccrine sweat gland duct. So you have cells down in here that line the insides of that tube there, and they secrete sweat. They produce sweat when you need to perspire, and that sends the sweat gets sent through the duct and deposited then on the surface of the skin. So those are the sweat glands that are involved in body cooling, as you might imagine. All right, I'll erase those. All right, this little thing over here is called a sebaceous gland, right there and right there. And in that part of the picture, in that part of the image, it's cut open, so you're seeing it in cross section. And over here, you're seeing it in 3 dimensions. So that's another one of these sebaceous glands. Sebaceous glands are built from a glandular epithelia. Same thing with your eccrine sweat glands. I forgot to point that out. That's the type of tissue that they're made from. They produce sebum, which is your skin oil. And if you notice, they're actually connected to the hair follicles. They're hooked right onto them. So when these glands produce your skin oil, which is called sebum, that sebum travels up through the hair follicles along the hair shaft and then gets deposited up here on the surface of the skin. Your skin oil gives your skin, helps keep it lubricated and moist. It's oil, so it has fatty acids in it, so it actually lowers the pH on the surface of your skin, which helps control the amounts of bacteria we have on the skin. We have tons of bacteria on our skin. I don't care how clean you are, you're covered in bacteria, but the sebum helps prevent the bacteria from growing in a completely out of control type manner. All right, let's see. Some other little features that we've got here. All right, red and blue. Anywhere you see red and blue on here, right there, or even up here. Remember these little hills here? What did we say those were? Those are part of the papillary sublayer of the dermis, and even up in there, you've got little tiny blood vessels. And that's all you need to recognize those as for now. The red ones are arteries, the blue ones are veins. The tiniest ones have other names. You'll learn those when you get to Biology 202. Okay, those are blood vessels. The darker kind of yellowish brown things you see here on the skin diagram, those are nervous tissues. So like right in there and right over here, and then you can kind of see how they branch out on the pictures like that and like that. Those are nerve endings. All right, so for example, like these nerve endings that are extending to the sebaceous gland there, they're going to stimulate oil release, where you have nerve endings connected like down in here to the eccrine sweat gland. Those are going to send signals to the sweat gland to start producing and releasing sweat. You know, like when your hypothalamus up in here controls your body temperature, we said it sends signals to effectors to help lower your body temperature when you're getting overheated. Those signals are sent down the nerves, and they eventually reach those nerve endings that contact the eccrine sweat gland. That tells the eccrine sweat gland to start producing sweat, which gets released up here onto the surface of the skin, and then you start to cool off. So nerve endings have many different roles. Some sense pain, some sense pressure, some sense touch, some sense temperature, lots of different things going on in the skin with all of the nervous tissues that you have in there. Nerve endings are composed of nervous tissue, as you might imagine. All right, another type of nervous tissue that you see here, or a nervous structure, right there, that thing that kind of looks like a thumbprint, and it's connected to a nerve over here. That is called a Pacinian corpuscle. Sounds very Italian, Pacinian. And a Pacinian corpuscle is a pressure receptor. So you have nerve endings that are wrapped up inside this kind of oval structure that kind of looks like a football. And the football portion is actually built from connective tissue, but you have nervous tissue on the inside. So when somebody is pressing on the surface of the skin and you feel pressure, the reason you're feeling pressure is because these Pacinian corpuscles detect that. So signals are sent to your brain, and your brain interprets that as pressure to let you know something's pressing up against you. And if it's strong enough, it'll cause you to move away from whatever it is putting that pressure on your skin. All right, let's see. We did all of that. I'm going to flip over here for a second. This next little skin chunk picture actually comes from thick skin. Part of it does. This is a thick skin chunk, and so if you look over here, notice over here how you've got a portion of the skin there that's going way up higher. That is your stratum corneum, which is much thicker in thick skin. You have thick skin in plantar regions and palmar regions of the body. So stratum corneum is much, 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 much thicker. So our little skin model, it goes up taller. That little light blue strip you see there is a representation of the stratum lucidum that we were talking about in the epidermis a little bit earlier. And hang on just a second. Okay, sorry about that. I just wanted to point that out to you, that thicker stratum corneum on the thick portion of our little skin model here. Some other little features here. Let's see. So notice right here, what do you think this is? You've got that little wad of tubes there. You're seeing it in 3 dimensions. And that is an eccrine sweat gland attached to the duct that brings the sweat up to the surface. Over here, they're showing you what one would look like sliced open, and it would have that type of appearance if you were looking at it under the microscope. So all these guys, Pacinian corpuscles, you got lots of nerve endings on here. Now up in here, these little smaller things that are up in the papillary sublayer of the dermis that kind of look like the Pacinian corpuscles, those are called Meissner's corpuscles. And your Meissner's corpuscles are touch sensors or touch receptors. So those are built from nervous tissue. They have some connective tissue surrounding that little oval part. And when the skin gets touched in a thick portion of the skin, you really mainly have these in the thick areas of the skin. Those help you sense touch in those thicker areas. So when you get touched, they send signals to the brain to help you perceive touch, and the brain interprets what part of the body is being touched for you. Okay, let me flip over here for a second. So this is actually another little skin model we have of axillary skin, armpit skin. All right, and so you're going to have many of the same structures in this location as well. A lot of it looks the same. However, you do have a different type of sweat gland here. This thing that looks like a big mumbo jumbo sweat gland, it really is, and there's a duct that's connected to it. This is called an apocrine sweat gland. So you only have those in your axillary regions and also in your anogenital regions, and they also produce sweat. They don't start working though until you reach puberty, and the sweat is thicker. It has different types of substances in it. It has a stronger odor to it, and we'll talk more about the differences between this apocrine sweat and eccrine sweat on the physiology side. Notice too that the duct doesn't go all the way to the surface. On an apocrine sweat gland, the duct connects into a hair follicle, and then the sweat from those glands travels through the hair follicles up here to the surface of the epidermis. All right, let me erase that. Let me point out something else as well. If you were, all the pink stuff you see here on the skin model pictures, you know, what is that? All the pink area in there. All right, so we're down in the dermis. We're not zooming in on any particular structure. So all that filler space in there, all that pink stuff is extracellular matrix. And the reason they have it colored pink is because if you actually looked at this tissue under the microscope, and they typically use these pink and purple dyes, the extracellular matrix takes up a pinkish dye really well because it's full of protein fibers. So you've got lots of collagenous and elastic fibers in all those filler spaces in the dermis, and that's very important. This is dense, irregular connective tissues. All of those collagen and elastic fibers help give your skin its important properties of being able to resist pulling and also snapping back into place after it has been stretched. All right, so I think we have pretty much covered all of the skin anatomy that you need to know. I will have some review activities, of course, on Blackboard for you to practice identifying things. Actually, I think images of these skin models are a little bit easier maybe to identify things on than the skin chunk from your textbook. but in many cases. But I'll have some practice activities for you to try to recognize these things on both, since you'll be looking at these skin chunk pictures in your textbook as you study. But, for example, there's your sebaceous glands on the skin chunk model from your textbook. Over here is an eccrine sweat gland, Pacinian corpuscle. So you can see most of the structures there are recognizable. You can see where your hair follicles are. There's an erector pili muscle. So they look pretty much the same as they do on our skin models from the laboratory. Okay, so that's all for that wraps up the required anatomy for Unit 2. Again, you'll have a 50-point anatomy test this time for Unit 2. You'll have a 75-point physiology test on the tissue functions and the functions of the skin as covered on your physiology lectures. All right, well, thank you very much, and please let me know if anything is not clear to you. Please get with me so I can clear those things up. It's also, I think, helpful to everybody in the class if you post questions you may have on the discussion board rather than just sending me a private email. Don't be embarrassed. Everybody's sending me questions, and so I think it's better for everybody if you just post them on the discussion boards, and everybody can benefit from something that you may not find to be clear enough while you're studying. All right, good luck studying, and have a good day.